The room was quiet, bathed in the low amber light of the evening. Dust floated through the air in slow spirals, catching the glow of a single desk lamp. Outside, the faint chorus of Pidgey filled the horizon, their cries soft and distant against the hum of a calm wind sweeping through Pallet Town. The professor sat still, his posture calm, his thoughts deep. Before him lay an empty sheet of parchment, the ink well beside it untouched. For a long time, he had stared at that empty space, not with hesitation, but with care. Words, after all, carried weight, especially the last ones. His study had not changed in decades. Shelves filled with books, sketches of Pokémon from regions near and far, small glass jars with samples of soil, leaves, scales, and feathers, fragments of a life spent observing, collecting, understanding. Every item had a memory, every object a story. A soft hum came from the equipment on the far table, a low mechanical rhythm, steady and familiar. The air smelled faintly of old paper, ink, and the gentle salt of the wind from the sea beyond the hill, the same sea that once carried the sound of adventure and laughter and the early calls of discovery. Now, it carried stillness. He had watched generations rise, trainers leaving Pallet Town with hearts full of hope, partners by their side, dreams larger than the regions they walked through. Some had returned. Others had vanished into the currents of time, leaving only stories behind. The professor smiled faintly, not with sadness, but with the quiet peace of someone who understood the flow of things. Every journey began and ended the same way, with a question and with wonder. The light from the lamp dimmed slightly as the evening deepened. Shadows stretched across the wooden floor. Outside, the sea shimmered faintly, touched by the last rays of the sun. The professor reached for his pen. The first stroke on the page was careful, deliberate, in the beginning of his final letter. The ink spread slowly across the paper, dark and steady. He wrote not to teach, but to remember, not to instruct, but to thank. The letter would not be addressed to anyone specific. It would be left for whoever would one day find it, perhaps a new assistant, perhaps a young trainer, perhaps a child staring out a window in Pallet Town, dreaming of their first Pokémon. And so, he began. Asterisk. To the one who comes after me, the world of Pokémon is vast, but not infinite. It breathes, it shifts, it remembers. And within its rhythm, every life, yours, mine, theirs, has meaning. Asterisk. He paused. The pen rested between his fingers. The words were not merely memory. They were continuation. The passing of knowledge, not through data or records, but through understanding. Outside, a breeze carried the faint scent of the ocean. A wind gull cried somewhere over the horizon, and the sound lingered, soft and clean. The professor continued to write. His thoughts drifted between the old and the new, the first days of field work, the discovery of habitats long forgotten, the endless wonder in the eyes of those who saw a Pokémon not as a tool, but as a companion. He thought of the forests of Viridian, where the early mornings were cold and full of mist. He thought of the sea routes toward Cinnabar, where the water shimmered with the movement of Tentacool and Horsey. He thought of the stars over Pewter, and how even then, beneath the vastness, he had felt the pulse of life, connecting all things. Each memory came gently, without sorrow. They were not losses, only echoes. He knew that soon, his days of exploration would end, but the world would continue, full of laughter, full of motion, full of the same questions that had always driven humankind to step into the grass for the first time and look beyond the familiar. And so he wrote, his words flowing now, slow but sure. Never stop asking why the world is alive. Never stop listening to what silence is trying to tell you. The sea wind grew stronger, pushing lightly against the open window. The lamp's flame flickered once, then steadied again. The professor placed his pen down for a moment and looked out across the town. Lights were beginning to glow in the distance. Homes, families, new beginnings. He breathed deeply, feeling the rhythm of the evening settle around him. This letter would take time. It was not a message of farewell, but a continuation, a bridge between generations. In the quiet of that room, with the sea whispering and the soft hum of old machines filling the space, the professor wrote his thoughts into the flow of the world itself. And beneath the amber light, the last letter of the professor began its journey. Morning came softly to Pallet Town. The light did not rise abruptly, but rather unfolded, a slow silver haze that touched the window panes, the trees, and the calm ocean beyond. The faint cries of Pidgey echoed again, blending with the whisper of waves brushing against the shoreline. The professor had not slept. The ink of the previous night's writing had dried into a soft gloss across the page, and as he ran his fingers lightly over the paper, he felt both the fragility and permanence of what had been written. Each word, he thought, was a seed. His gaze drifted toward an old photograph on the shelf. A younger version of himself standing beside a field of tall grass. Sunlight glinting off his glasses. A notebook held close to his chest. That day had been his beginning. The day he first understood that the world of Pokémon was not a map to be filled, but a living presence to be listened to. He remembered the air that morning, damp with the scent of soil and dew. He had walked beyond the town's edge, notebook in hand, guided by curiosity alone. The grass was alive with small rustles, caterpie weaving along the ground, weedle climbing up bark in quiet procession, the occasional flicker of Rattata darting from shadow to shadow. Every sound was its own form of conversation, every movement a line of poetry written in nature's rhythm. He had crouched to observe a caterpie once, its body glistening under the filtered sunlight, each segment moving in perfect unity. It was nothing extraordinary at first glance. Yet as he watched, he began to notice something profound. The pattern of motion, the silent patience, the unbroken connection between creature and environment. He realized then that discovery was not an act of conquest, but of humility. Knowledge did not grow from capturing, but from noticing. He wrote that first thought down in his field journal, a single sentence that would follow him throughout his life. To understand Pokémon, one must first listen to silence. That silence, he found, was never empty. It held the heartbeat of the world. The wind carried fragments of stories older than human memory, songs of the forest, whispers of the river, the distant pulse of the sea. He remembered the first time he saw a Pidgeot rise from the tree line. The air had shifted. The sound of its wings rolled through the morning like thunder softened into breath. It moved with grace, not dominance, and he stood there for what felt like hours, feeling the world rearrange itself around that single moment of flight. Later, when he returned to town with notes and sketches, the other researchers had smiled kindly at his excitement. To them, it had been merely another record, another entry in the growing catalog of Pokémon behavior. But for him, it was something sacred. That night, he sat at his small wooden desk, candlelight flickering across his journal, and wrote his first conclusion. The natural world does not exist for us. We exist within it. Those words shaped his path. They guided every study, every decision, every lesson he would later pass to his students and assistants. The balance between humankind and Pokémon, he would come to understand, was not one of control, but of coexistence. As the years unfolded, he saw that truth reflected everywhere. In trainers who treated their partners as family, in forests that healed after being left untouched, in the small gestures of compassion that crossed species and borders alike. Now, as he wrote the memory into his letter, the professor smiled faintly. The ink moved steadily beneath his hand, forming lines that were less about information and more about remembrance. There was never a first discovery, he wrote softly. Only the first moment I decided to see. The ocean breeze carried through the window again. ruffling the papers on his desk. Somewhere outside, a gentle hum, the sound of a wingull gliding low over the surf. The day had fully awakened. Yet time inside the room seemed suspended, unhurried, as if the world itself were allowing him the space to remember. He leaned back slightly, eyes drifting to the horizon. He thought of all the trainers who had once stood before him, full of nervous hope. He had seen that same light, that same first discovery in every one of them. It was not a lesson that could be taught. It was something they would find the moment they looked at their first Pokémon and felt connection instead of command. The memory of his first day in the field faded gently into another. The first time he saw a Charmander in the wild, the flame on its tail flickering against the dusk. He had kept his distance, knowing that observation required stillness. The little Pokémon had turned its head slightly, sensing his presence, but not fleeing. Their eyes met, and in that quiet recognition, he felt the unspoken truth that curiosity itself was a bridge. Years later, he would think of that moment, often, especially when guiding young trainers. He would tell them to listen before acting, to see before naming, to understand before deciding. It was not advice from books. It was what the world itself had taught him. The ink on the page dried again, shimmering faintly in the growing light. The professor exhaled slowly, placing the pen down beside the letter. The morning was nearly complete now. The horizon had shifted from silver to gold. He stood for a moment, stretching the stillness from his shoulders, and looked once more at the photograph of his younger self. Time, he thought, was a kind of conversation too, not one of words, but of echoes. He smiled again, and whispered under his breath a thought that did not need to be written. That discovery was never about finding something new, but about remembering what the heart already knew. Outside, the first wind of midday rose, scattering the leaves in slow spirals. The professor closed his notebook, the soft rustle of paper, blending with the ocean's steady rhythm. The letter on his desk remained open, the ink still dark and alive. It waited for the next memory, the next truth, the next part of the journey. And as he turned toward the window, watching the golden light settle over Pallet Town, he knew exactly what to write next. It would be about friendship, about how no discovery, no matter how grand, meant anything if it wasn't shared. Afternoon sunlight drifted across the study, warm and golden. It poured through the window in slanted lines, illuminating shelves of books, framed sketches, and jars that glimmered faintly as if holding small fragments of the day itself. The professor sat quietly, the gentle hum of the sea still audible in the distance. The rhythm of waves and wind had always been his truest companions, constant and patient, like the heartbeat of the world. He dipped his pen once more into the ink, pausing before the page as if waiting for thought to meet memory. The words that followed came easily, almost on their own, shaped by decades of watching and listening. Knowledge, he wrote slowly, is never a solitary pursuit. It walks beside us, breathes beside us, and listens when we are silent. The truest discoveries were never mine alone. He remembered those who had shared the path, the students who once crowded around his desk, their faces bright with curiosity, the travelers who a dozen down returned from distant regions with notebooks damp from rain and filled with stories of mountains and forests. Yet above all, he remembered his companions, not the human ones, but those who had never spoken a word, yet communicated everything. In the earliest years of his research, before Pallet Town had become a name known across Kanto, he had worked in the field with a small team of Pokémon. They were not assistants in the way machines could be. They were partners who shaped the very rhythm of his work. A gentle Bulbasaur had been among the first, steady, observant, always alert to the Earth's subtle signs. When storms approached, it would lift its head to the air before any cloud had darkened the horizon. When the seasons turned, its leaves deepened in color, matching the pulse of the soil beneath them. From Bulbasaur, he learned to read the ground, to feel how every root and stone was connected by invisible threads of life. There had also been a Pidgeotto, proud and unbound. It would soar high above the trees, its shadow crossing the fields in silence. He had never commanded it to fly. It chose its own paths, circling when it wished, returning when it pleased. And yet, without fail, it always came back to rest on the same branch near his tent at dusk. That, he thought later, was the essence of trust, not obedience, but understanding. The professor's mind wandered further, to the quiet lakes where he once studied water Pokémon during his early travels. There he had watched as Magikarp leapt from the surface in rhythmic intervals, their scales flashing like scattered sunlight. Many dismissed them as weak, but he had seen resilience in their endless persistence, in the way they moved with the current rather than against it. Years later, when he would watch one evolve into a Gyarados, he would think of that same patience transformed into power, proof that potential often slept beneath what the world overlooked. He wrote more, his hand steady, his words flowing like the calm tide. Every companion teaches something the world cannot. We name them, we study them, yet it is they who study us. The measure of wisdom is not what we discover about Pokémon, but what they reveal about ourselves. The memory of one particular day returned to him, the first time he traveled beyond the safety of familiar routes. It had been near the edge of the Viridian Forest, the light dim and green beneath the canopy. He had walked for hours, every sound magnified. The rustle of leaves, the faint creak of branches swaying overhead, the heartbeat of nature surrounding him. Then, from the shadows, a Butterfree had emerged, its wings dusted with pollen, moving in slow, deliberate arcs through the filtered sunlight. He had stopped, watching as it hovered above a bed of wildflowers. Its wings stirred the air gently, and for a moment he thought he could see the pollen rise like golden mist. The sight was small, almost insignificant in scale, yet it filled him with something he had no word for, a quiet recognition that life's beauty did not need to be extraordinary to be meaningful. That was when he understood that companionship extended beyond interaction. It was presence itself, shared and unspoken. He looked up from the page, letting his eyes rest on the Pokeball that sat on the shelf before him. It was old, its paint faded, the metal slightly worn. Inside it rested no living Pokémon, only the memory of one that had long since returned to the wild. He had released it years ago, believing that true companionship meant freedom when the time came. Even so, the empty Pokeball remained on his desk, a silent symbol of gratitude. He thought of the trainers who had passed through Pallet Town, each beginning their own journey with a partner at their side. He had seen countless pairs walk down that familiar dirt road, a Charmander's tail flame glowing in the morning light, a Squirtle adjusting its shell. Before the first steps, a Bulbasaur glancing up at its new friend with cautious trust. None of them understood yet the depth of what they were about to begin. He often wondered as he watched them go, whether they realized that the bond they formed was the truest discovery they would ever make. The professor lifted his pen again. "It is companionship that defines this world," he wrote. "The connection between living beings is not measured in strength or success, but in the quiet ways we learn to walk together." Outside, the wind shifted. The smell of the sea drifted into the room again, mingled with the faint sweetness of flowers carried from the nearby hills. He let the scent fill him with calm, grounding his thoughts in the present. The sea had always done that, reminded him that everything, no matter how vast or ancient, moved in harmony with something else. His eyes drifted to the far corner of the study, where a small terrarium stood, overgrown with moss and fern. A single, Oddish had once lived there, planted by his younger assistants during a study on nocturnal photosynthesis. It had long since been returned to the fields. but the moss still thrived, soft and luminous beneath the filtered light. Even now he found comfort in its persistence, a quiet green reminder that life continued without audience or applause. He began to write again, his hand moving more freely now. We call ourselves researchers, explorers, scientists. Yet beneath every title lies the same truth. We are companions walking beside those we study. The moment we forget that, our knowledge becomes empty. He paused, setting the pen down. The ink shimmered wetly for a moment before drying into the page. A sense of stillness filled the room, not emptiness, but completion, like the quiet that follows a gentle wave's retreat. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the wooden frame creak softly beneath his weight. He thought again of the long years behind him, the journeys through forests and mountains, the meetings with other professors across distant regions, the endless exchange of notes and theories. And yet, through all of it, the moments that lingered were not those of discovery or recognition, but of companionship. The warmth of a Pokémon's gaze, the brush of a feathered wing, the hum of life, shared without demand. He realized then that what he was writing was not simply a letter, but a remembrance of connection. The last letter was, in truth, not an ending. It was a continuation of all those silent bonds that stretched beyond words, beyond species, beyond time itself. The sound of a distant talo reached him from outside, a clear, bright call against the golden air. He smiled faintly, closing his eyes for a moment to listen. The song rose and fell, carried on the wind, and for a heartbeat, he could almost hear the echo of countless others. Cries, rustles, songs, and whispers, weaving together like a single voice across the living world. He opened his eyes and looked at the page once more. The ink had dried. The words stood firm and quiet. No one walks this world alone, he wrote finally. Every step we take is accompanied by something unseen, something kind, something alive. The sunlight softened as the day leaned toward dusk. Shadows lengthened, stretching across the room, like gentle reminders of passing time. The professor placed the pen down beside the inkwell, the faint clink echoing softly. He sat for a long while, simply breathing, listening to the room breathe with him. Outside, the world continued. Pokémon stirring in the trees, waves curling upon the sand. The unending dialogue of life itself. Inside, the professor's words rested on the page like leaves settled upon still water, unmoving, yet full of meaning. The letter waited for what came next, and in the growing quiet, he felt it clearly, that the next memory would not be about discovery, nor companionship, but something deeper. The balance between all things. As the last light touched the horizon, he knew what to call the next part. The morning broke with a softness that seemed older than time itself. Pallet Town lay beneath a thin veil of mist, and from the open window of the professor's study, the world appeared half dreaming. The sea, the sky, and the land merged into a quiet horizon of pale light. Nothing hurried, nothing demanded. Everything simply was. The professor sat at his desk again, a cup of tea now cooled beside him. The ink in his well glistened faintly, reflecting the dim light of dawn. He turned a new page, its surface bright and untouched, and allowed his thoughts to gather like the fog beyond the glass. The rhythm of his breathing matched the rhythm of the ocean. He had spent a lifetime studying the world, collecting, recording, classifying. Yet in all his years, the most profound lessons had never come from data, nor from laboratories, nor even from the marvel of discovery. They had come from balance. He dipped his pen into the ink and began to write. All life exists in a balance, so delicate that few ever see it. The ocean breathes because the forests allow it. The mountains stand because the roots hold them. Every heartbeat answers another. Every silence has a sound. He paused, letting the ink settle, and looked out across the hills. The air was still, yet full of quiet motion, a butterfree drifting lazily through the garden. The faint stir of leaves, the shimmer of dew evaporating in the first warmth of the day. These were not random moments. They were threads in a vast pattern that stretched far beyond what even his knowledge could name. He had witnessed imbalance, too. He remembered the years when storms had struck the coasts of Cinnabar with unrelenting force, when the seas had boiled with unrest, and the skies had turned harsh. The natural world had cried out then, not in anger but in warning. The currents had shifted, the migrations had changed, and the Pokémon had vanished from familiar grounds. In those days, he had walked the beaches with his journal pressed to his chest, feeling the deep ache of something beyond his reach. The knowledge that humanity, in its pursuit of progress, often forgot that progress was not ownership. He wrote again, slower this time, as if speaking to the earth itself, through ink and thought. The world does not belong to us. We belong to the world. And when we forget this truth, the balance tilts, not in punishment, but in silence. His hand trembled slightly as he set the pen down. The wind moved through the room, lifting the corner of a nearby page. It carried the scent of salt and grass, a reminder of the harmony that lived even in the smallest things. He remembered the time he had spent on the Seafoam Islands, those deep caverns of ice and light, where Articuno's wings stirred the air into crystal. He had never sought the creature, only its traces, the frozen feathers, the sudden drops of temperature, the silence that followed its passing. Yet, in that silence, he had understood something elemental, that nature protected its balance, not through control, but through mystery. The legendary Pokémon were not rulers of nature. They were its reflections. Their presence was the Earth's memory of equilibrium. He had seen the same truth years later when the skies over Johto had changed, when news of storms and shifting winds had reached even Pallet Town. The world was full of signs if one listened carefully enough. Lugia had stirred beneath the waves, and in its awakening, the planet had reminded itself of order. These events were not myths to him. They were messages, written in motion and weather, in song and silence. Humanity, he thought, was still learning how to read them. He looked again at the page and wrote with renewed clarity. Balance is not something that can be kept. It can only be remembered. It exists not in stillness, but in the movement between extremes, in the dance between fire and water, between life and decay. The afternoon light grew warmer, spilling gold across the desk. He watched as the particles of dust swirled gently in the sunbeam, their movements unhurried, as though they too obeyed an unseen harmony. He thought of the forests of Viridian again, their vast canopies, breathing in tandem with the creatures beneath them. He had once measured the air there, studying how the humidity shifted when flocks of Pidgey took flight. The data had fascinated him, but it was not the numbers that stayed with him. It was the sensation of standing in that living cathedral of green, feeling the weight of coexistence pressing softly from all sides. He had realized then that balance was not a state to achieve, but a relationship to honor. And every being, human, Pokémon or otherwise, played a part in sustaining it. He continued to write, his words flowing like a quiet stream. A caterpie that eats a leaf, a Fearow that takes to the sky, a trainer who releases a partner back into the wild, all are movements of, quote, the same pattern. Harmony is not perfection. It is participation. He smiled faintly as he read the line back. For years, he had tried to explain this truth in lectures and research papers, yet it had always eluded language. Only now, at the quiet edge of his life, did the words feel simple enough to express it. He placed the pen aside for a moment and let his gaze travel across his study, the artifacts of a lifetime gathered in stillness. Fossils rested beside shells, pressed flowers beside field notes, small stones labeled with neat handwriting, marking regions long revisited. Everything here, he realized, was a record not of ownership, but of relationship. Even the fossils, those fragments of ancient lives, were reminders that the world continued because it changed. Life ended so that it could begin again. The professor breathed deeply, feeling that truth settled within him like an old companion. The sea outside shimmered brighter now, its waves calm and rhythmic. Somewhere, beyond the horizon, Lapras would be traveling their quiet paths through the current, singing their songs to one another beneath the surface. He imagined the sound, low, resonant, eternal, a hymn to continuity. He reached again for the pen. If there is one truth to leave behind, he wrote, it is this: the world sustains itself through giving. Every breath we take, every step we make, is borrowed from the earth. When we give back, through care, respect, or even silence, balance restores itself. He paused. The ink shimmered wetly, a deep reflective black. Outside, the wind began to shift again. Gentle, cool, carrying the faint scent of rain. Clouds gathered on the horizon, their edges glowing with the light of the descending sun. He listened, feeling the world preparing for its natural transition, from light into dark, from day into night. Balance again, always balance. He leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking softly, and closed his eyes. The rhythm of waves and wind merged into a single slow pulse. He felt it through the floorboards, through the air, through the paper itself. Time had no sharp edges anymore, only tides. He thought of the generations to come, of the young trainers who would continue walking into the tall grass with wide eyes and unsteady steps, of the researchers who would set up their instruments under the same skies, believing they were the first to measure, to name, to understand. They would all in their own time learn the same truth, that the world did not need saving, it only needed remembering. He smiled, the faintest curve of serenity crossing his face, and opened his eyes to the last light of the day. The mist had cleared, revealing the horizon in full. The sun rested upon the edge of the sea, like a lantern set gently into water. He dipped his pen once more and wrote the final words of the chapter. When you stand in the field and the wind moves through the grass, know that you are part of its command motion. Do not try to hold the balance. Become it. The ink dried slowly, glimmering faintly in the fading light. The professor set the pen down, folded his hands, and allowed the quiet to return. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, soft, rhythmic, perfect. And in the calm of his study, the world continued to breathe through him. The morning after the rain came quietly. The air was cool, clear, and rich with the scent of renewal. The drops that had clung to the leaves overnight now slid down their edges in slow glimmers of silver, vanishing into the soil below. The sea beyond Pallet Town was calm again, breathing in long, patient waves that shimmered with pale light. Inside his study, the professor sat by the window, his letters spread open before him. The pages had begun to grow thick, filled now with days and thoughts that had flowed together like a single current. His hand hovered over the paper for a long while, his gaze lost in the brightness of the sky. It was the sky that had always guided him. He had spent countless hours watching it change, from the blue stillness of midday to the soft rose of dusk, and onward to the indigo depths of night. Every shade was a memory, every cloud a voice from the living world. He dipped his pen in ink and began again. The sky holds memory the way the ocean holds reflection. It carries the stories of those who move within it and the silence of those who no longer do. The professor's thoughts drifted backward to a time when he had spent weeks in the field near the borders of Viridian and Pewter. studying the patterns of migrating bird Pokémon. The air there had been sharp and cold, and each morning he had woken before dawn, watching the sky turn from violet to gold as the flocks gathered. Pidgeotto, Fearow, and Spearow had filled the horizon in long, flowing arcs. He had taken careful notes, his pencil scratching across damp pages, yet even as he wrote, he knew that no instrument could truly measure what he was witnessing. Migration was more than instinct. It was remembrance, a living map written into the bodies of those who flew. They did not simply travel from place to place. They followed paths, remembered by wind and season, by stars unseen to human eyes. He had once stood upon a ridge, the wind rushing through his coat, and felt as though he were inside a breathing organism, a network of movement and memory spanning the world. He wrote on, his handwriting steady. To fly is to remember where one has been, even when the ground is no longer beneath you. The sky is not a destination. It is continuity. As the morning deepened, the light shifted again, scattering through the faint mist, still clinging to the edges of the hills. The professor could hear the gentle cry of windgull carried from the coast, their voices overlapping in loose harmony. To most, it was only sound. To him, it was history. He thought of the skies above Johto, where the great towers of Ecruteak touched the clouds. He had once stood at their base, years ago, looking up into the wind that swirled endlessly above. The air there had been charged with something unseen, the residue of faith, of stories whispered across generations. The people believed that Ho-Oh had once flown above those towers, its feathers scattering light that became rainbows. He had never seen the creature himself, yet he had felt its presence in the motion of the air, in the shimmering warmth that passed briefly across the skin when the sunlight bent just right. He understood then that memory was not limited to the living. The world itself remembered, through wind, through light, through the silence that followed flight. The ink continued to move across the page in calm, unbroken lines. Even when wings are gone, their patterns remain. Every breeze is shaped by what has moved through it. He paused, setting the pen down beside the page. Outside, the clouds were beginning to thin. The blue returned, vast and pure, stretching toward the far horizon where sea met sky. He closed his eyes for a moment, and the images came unbidden, flocks wheeling in graceful arcs, tails of dust and gold trailing behind, clouds breaking open to reveal sunlight in sudden, radiant bursts. The faint shimmer of legendary wings, glimpsed only through memory and feeling. He thought of Rayquaza once, though he had never seen it, only studied reports, listened to those who had claimed to feel the tremor of its passing high in the stratosphere. Even the air itself had memory of such beings. The pressure changed, the temperature shifted, and for a heartbeat, the whole world seemed to listen. He smiled faintly at the thought, his breath slow, his eyes still closed. There were forces beyond comprehension, yet even they existed within balance. The sky was vast, yes, but not endless. It had layers, rhythms, responsibilities, just as the ocean did, just as the land. He opened his eyes again and reached for the pen. There are no borders in the wind, he wrote. It passes freely, carrying pollen, song, and the scent of rain from one world to another. Perhaps this is why the sky humbles us, because it belongs to everyone and to no one. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, his gaze wandering once more to the clouds. They were moving east now, slow and deliberate, like thought taking shape. He could feel the room breathe with him, the quiet expansion and contraction that marked the presence of something alive. He thought of the skies over Pallet Town during his youth, the summers when he would lie on the hillside and watch the shapes of clouds shift until dusk, when the first stars would appear. It was under that same sky that his fascination had begun, long before he knew the names of regions or species. The world had always spoken to him through stillness, and the sky had been its most patient teacher. He reached for a small telescope resting near the shelf, an old companion from his younger years. its brass worn smooth from countless nights of use. He turned it slightly toward the window, though he did not lift it. It was not the stars he saw today, but the space between them. The quiet distances where light traveled, unmeasured. He remembered the nights at his observatory, the hum of machinery, the soft clicking of gears as the telescope tracked the constellations. Above, the stars had formed familiar patterns, not maps of conquest, but reminders of continuity. The same constellations that guided bird Pokémon across regions had guided humans across oceans. The same light that had touched ancient forests still touched his window now. He wrote again, his pen steady. The stars are not separate from the earth. They are its reflection, seen from a distance. The wind moves between them all, linking light and leaf, sea and sky. The day moved quietly onward. Shadows shifted across the floor, stretching and softening with the arc of the sun. Time seemed to lose its edges again. The professor's movements were slow, deliberate, like those of someone attuned to an unseen rhythm. He placed his pen down at last and folded his hands, letting stillness fill the space between breaths. The sea's voice rose faintly through the window, the long exhale of waves meeting the shore. The call of a distant pharaoh drifted from the western cliffs, high and clear, echoing against the air. He looked upward, following the sound. A small flock was crossing the horizon, their formation steady, their movement unhurried. They glided with the wind rather than against it, their wings tilting to catch the invisible currents. For a moment, he imagined he could feel those currents too, the air brushing his face, cool and infinite. He thought of how many generations of those same species had flown across the same routes, carrying not only themselves, but the memory of every flight before them. It was not immortality. It was inheritance. He smiled again and turned back to his letter, writing one final passage for the day. The memory of the sky is not stored in clouds or stars. It lives within everything that moves. To breathe is to share in that memory. And when we look upward, it is not to escape the earth, but to remember how it connects us. He laid the pen aside once more, the ink dark and gleaming. Outside, the last of the mist had vanished. The sky stood unbroken, blue and whole, its vastness filled with invisible movement. The professor closed his notebook gently, his hands resting upon it. He let the silence of the room and the hum of the living world merge into one. The day had unfolded and closed upon itself, just as the clouds had done, endlessly repeating, endlessly renewing. As the light began to fade toward evening, he felt a sense of calm settle within him. The sky would darken soon, and the stars would return, carrying their own stories, not of endings, but of remembrance. And so he sat, listening, breathing, remembering, a single figure beneath the boundless, ancient memory of the sky. The sea had always been the beginning. Long before the first discovery, before the lectures and the journals, before the world had taken shape in his mind as something to study, there had been the sound of waves. They had shaped his earliest understanding of time, the slow pulse of existence, eternal and unhurried. This morning, the sea called to him again. It was calm, breathing in long, deliberate sighs. The mist that had risen before dawn now lingered just above the horizon, its pale curtain shifting like a dream that refused to fade. The professor stood by the open window of his study, listening to that steady rhythm. Each sound carried memory, the hiss of foam against rock, the distant calls of winggull, the deep rumble beneath it all. He took his pen and began to write, the ink flowing like water on the page. The sea does not speak in words. It speaks in patience. Every wave that reaches the shore has been shaped by 1,000 unseen movements. Its voice is the memory of seed, everything it has touched. He remembered his early expeditions to the coast of Cinnabar Island, long before the volcano had changed its shape. The air there had been heavy with salt and warmth, the kind that clung to the skin even in shade. He had camped near the rocks for days at a time, tracing the ebb and flow of the tides. At night, he would fall asleep to the rhythmic song of the waves, his mind drifting between wakefulness and dream. The world had felt vast and alive then, not through discovery, but through surrender. He had learned that the ocean could not be measured in depth alone. It was not a body of water, but a body of memory. He paused, letting the thoughts settle before continuing. The sea is the oldest mind we know. It remembers what the sky forgets, and within its depths, life dreams itself again and again. He looked out toward the water. In the distance, the faint silhouettes of lapras glided through the morning light, their movements so gentle. They barely disturbed the surface. Their songs carried faintly across the bay, deep, resonant tones that seemed to echo both joy and melancholy. He closed his eyes, listening more deeply. The lapras song was not random. It was structured, layered. It moved in waves, following the same pattern as the tides themselves. He had once studied those melodies with instruments, recording the subtle rise and fall, but now he preferred simply to feel them. The sound touched something within him, something that reminded him that the world spoke in more than language. He wrote again, "The song of lapras is the breath of the ocean, made audible. It carries no meaning to the ear, yet it restores balance to the heart. The world, it seems, does not ask to be understood, only remembered." He let the pen rest for a moment. His thoughts wandered to another memory, the long nights aboard research vessels, when he and his small team had drifted far beyond the coast, instruments humming softly against the waves. Beneath them, the sonar had mapped vast caverns of silence. Occasionally, shapes would rise from those depths, enormous, slow, deliberate, shadows that moved like thoughts through the deep. Sometimes there had been sound, a single, low tone that lingered long after it was gone. The instruments could not capture it fully, and the recordings never did it justice. It was not merely a sound, it was a presence. He had known then that something ancient still moved below, something that had watched the ages unfold without interference. He had thought of Lugia often in those moments, not as a legend, but as a truth. Not as a creature to be found, but as an idea that had already found him. He wrote again, slower this time. "In the deepest waters, silence and sound become the same thing. To listen there is not to hear, but to feel. The sea's heart beats beneath our comprehension, and within it rests the memory of creation." The day drifted onward, sunlight, spilling through the window in shifting patterns. The glimmer of reflected waves danced across the walls, moving like living light. The air carried the scent of salt and algae, mingling with the dry ink and parchment. He breathed deeply. Each inhale brought the ocean closer. It was not only sound, it was rhythm, texture, temperature. The ocean's presence filled every particle of air in Pallet Town, even this far inland. He remembered the way children would play along the shoreline, their laughter rising and falling with the waves. Even without realizing it, they had always moved in harmony with the sea's timing. Humanity had never been apart from it. It had simply forgotten the connection. He began to write again. The ocean does not separate lands. It connects them. It carries fragments of each shore to the next, blending them until the world becomes one body again. Every drop that touches the sand has journeyed farther than any traveler. He paused, closing his eyes. Once more, somewhere far below the waves, he imagined the coral forests, endless spires of color, growing in silence, feeding and fading with the currents. He pictured the schools of Pokémon weaving through them, their bodies shimmering with bioluminescent light. There, life was both ancient and new. He had once studied a colony of tentacool along the Vermilion coast. They had pulsed gently in unison, their movement a silent symphony. He had realized then that they did not move for survival alone. They moved for rhythm. Every creature of the sea was part of an ongoing song, each pulse an echo of something greater. He smiled faintly and wrote once more. To exist within the sea is to live in music. Every movement, every current, every breath of water is part of the same eternal composition. The ocean is not chaos. It is harmony too vast to measure. The sunlight began to dim. The day turned to afternoon, and the shadows grew longer. The sea outside continued its slow cadence, rising and falling, unbroken. A faint drizzle began again. Light, transient, just enough to blur the horizon into soft gray. The professor placed his pen aside for a moment and rose from his chair. He moved to the open window, resting his hands on the wooden frame. The wind carried cool droplets against his face. The taste of salt lingered on his lips. Below, the garden swayed in rhythm with the storm. Each blade of grass, each leaf, responded to the same invisible pulse. It was the same rhythm that lived in every ocean wave, every gust of wind, every breath, drawn by every living thing. He returned to his desk and wrote a final passage for the day. When we listen to the sea, we do not listen to water. We listen to everything that has ever lived. Its voice is both memory and promise, the reminder that all life is one continuous tide. The rain deepened, filling the silence of the study with a soft percussion. The sound was steady, unending, as though the sky itself had joined the song of the sea. He leaned back, eyes half closed, and let the rhythm wash through him. The world had narrowed to three things: the sound of rain, the scent of salt, and the pulse of the ocean beyond the mist. He thought, not with the sharpness of reason, but with the calmness of surrender. The sea had never been something to understand. It had always been something to remember. The first sound, the first motion, the first cradle of all things. He smiled faintly as his thoughts drifted outward, as though carried by the tide itself. The day faded, leaving only the whisper of waves and the echo of rain against the roof. The ink on the page dried slowly, shining like the surface of still water under moonlight. And in that soft and endless rhythm, the professor felt the world breathe with him. One slow, patient breath, shared between earth and ocean. The morning light filtered through the canopy in long, thin shafts of gold. The air was damp and cool, filled with the faint scent of moss and soil. The professor moved slowly along the narrow path that wound through the Viridian forest, each step sinking softly into the earth. The sounds of civilization had faded behind him long ago. What remained was the pulse of nature, slow, steady, and alive. He paused for a moment to listen. The forest did not speak in sound, yet its silence was full of voices. The leaves rustled gently. The distant call of a pidgey drifted through the air, and beneath it all was a faint hum, the vibration of countless unseen lives, breathing and growing together. He took out his notebook and turned to a fresh page. The ink from earlier entries had dried, curling slightly at the edges. His pen moved slowly now, not as a scientist recording data, but as a listener transcribing what could not be heard. The forest is not quiet. It is a conversation too vast for language. Every leaf, every drop of moisture, every motion of air is a reply to something older. The Viridian forest had always felt ancient to him, not merely because of its age, but because of the way it held time. Days seemed longer here, yet somehow also shorter, as though the forest ignored the rhythm of clocks. It had its own measure of existence, one that moved with the growth of roots and the decay of fallen leaves. He had spent many years walking these paths, observing, collecting, learning. He remembered the first time he had entered this forest as a young man, how immense it had seemed, how full of mystery. Even now, in age, it still held that same quiet majesty. He could feel it in the air, the faint pulse of life that traveled from the soil to the trees, from the trees to the wind, and from the wind to the creatures that moved unseen among the branches. Every part of it was connected. Every moment depended on another. He wrote again. The forest does not grow by chance. It grows through memory. The roots remember rain, the soil remembers sunlight, and the trees remember each other. A soft breeze passed through, stirring the canopy above. Light shifted like liquid gold, dappling the ground with moving patterns. The forest was breathing. He thought of the countless Pokémon that made their homes here. Caterpie inching quietly along the bark, Metapod hanging motionless from branches, Beedrill nests hidden in the higher limbs. None of them moved without reason, yet none of them rushed. Their rhythm matched the pulse of the earth itself. He had once spent 3 full days observing a single patch of ground, watching how the same Metapod changed colors slightly each morning, how the leaves around it grew brighter, how the air itself seemed to shift in response. The transformation had not been sudden. It had been patient. The forest taught patience better than any teacher. He dipped his pen again and wrote, the ink flowing in slow, deliberate lines. Change in the forest is invisible until it has already happened. The greatest transformations are the ones the world does not notice. He stopped and listened once more. The air was thick with life. The faint crackle of leaves underfoot mingled with the hum of insects. Somewhere nearby, the soft sound of running water trickled over stone. The forest had no beginning or end, only flow. He remembered his earliest research expeditions here, when he had tried to measure everything: temperature, light, humidity. He had charted the positions of nests, mapped out feeding patterns, cataloged behaviors. Yet the more data he gathered, the less he understood. The forest resisted analysis. It could not be reduced to variables. It was a living intelligence, and it revealed itself only to those willing to listen. He smiled faintly at the thought. Back then, he had been certain that understanding required control. Now, he knew the opposite was true. Understanding required surrender. To listen to the forest, he wrote, is to forget the self. The more we name, the less we hear. The canopy above shifted again, letting through a brief, radiant beam of light that illuminated the forest floor. For a moment, everything shimmered: the moss, the trunks, the small dew droplets that clung to every surface. It was as though the forest itself had paused to breathe, to reveal its quiet beauty. He thought of how the world beyond these trees moved, cities filled with motion and noise, where progress was measured in speed. But here, time unfolded in spirals rather than lines. Every decay fed growth. Every death gave birth to life again. The forest knew what humanity had forgotten, that stillness was not absence, but transformation. He closed his eyes and let the sounds of the forest fill him. The faint rustle of branches blended with the murmur of distant streams. He could almost feel the pulse of the roots below, stretching wide and deep, connecting each tree to another. The forest was a single body, not a collection of parts. He began writing once more. The roots beneath the soil form a memory, older than language. They pass messages slower than thought, yet truer than speech. Through them, the forest dreams together. He recalled an experiment from years ago, one that had never been published. He had observed 2 trees standing far apart, one in full sunlight and the other in shadow. When he measured the nutrients in their roots, he found something astonishing. The shaded tree had received sustenance from the one in the light. The forest shared what it had. Life did not compete here. It cooperated. He looked around now, imagining that same invisible exchange taking place beneath him. It humbled him, as it always had. The trees did not need to speak to understand one another. They simply were. Perhaps the forest teaches what the world resists, he wrote. That strength is not isolation, but connection. The hours passed quietly. Light shifted, shadows stretched, and the forest changed its colors with the turning of the sun. A few butterfree drifted through the air, their wings catching the gold of afternoon. The professor watched them move until they disappeared into the deeper shade. He thought again of the young trainers who often entered this place for the first time, eager, untested, their eyes full of adventure. He hoped they understood what this forest truly was. Not a challenge to be conquered, but a presence to be respected. Every path, every rustle, every shimmer of light was part of a story older than them all. He returned to his writing, his hands steady, his heart quiet. When one walks through the forest, the world grows larger, not smaller. The silence expands. In that silence, life speaks more clearly than in any noise. The light began to fade now, turning the canopy to shades of amber and violet. The forest seemed to exhale, preparing for night. The calls of day Pokémon grew softer, while the low hum of nocturnal life began to rise. He closed his notebook slowly and placed his pen upon it. He did not need to write more. The forest had said everything for him. He lingered a while longer, breathing in the scent of earth and leaf. The breeze that passed through the trees was cool and clean, carrying with it a kind of peace he had never found anywhere else. The world outside the forest would continue in its restless motion, but here, everything returned to rhythm. He knew that when he left, the forest would not remember him. Yet, it would remain within him. Its patience, its stillness, its quiet intelligence. The whisper of the forest does not fade, he thought. It continues in the breath of those who have heard it. As the last light fell through the branches, he turned to make his way back toward the edge of the trees. The path was the same, yet somehow different, changed not by the world, but by perception. The forest had not spoken, yet he had been taught. And as he walked, the whisper of leaves followed him like a memory too gentle to end. The mountains rose in quiet majesty against the horizon, their peaks veiled in thin clouds that moved as slowly as thought. The professor had come here many times before, yet each ascent felt like the first. There was something eternal about these slopes, the way they resisted time, the way they held silence as though it were a sacred thing. The air was thin, carrying with it the scent of stone and distance. Every sound, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots, the soft call of a distant Firo, was absorbed by the immensity of space. Here, even echoes seemed hesitant to return. He found a small ledge overlooking the valley below and rested there. The view stretched endlessly, forests fading into mist, rivers tracing silver lines through the green, the sea beyond shimmering faintly at the edge of vision. The world was vast, and yet perfectly still. He opened his notebook and let the wind turn its pages. When it settled, he began to write. The mountains do not speak. They remember. Their silence is not emptiness, but fullness beyond sound. He paused, the words anchoring him like the stones beneath his feet. The mountains had always reminded him of patience, not the patience of waiting, but the patience of being. Their existence was slow, deliberate, unchanging. They endured not because they resisted time, but because they accepted it. He looked toward the snow that capped the highest peaks. Each flake that rested there had once been part of the ocean, lifted by wind, carried through cloud, returned to stillness. Even here, high above the world, the rhythm of the sea remained. He wrote again. Nothing is lost in the cycle of the earth. Water becomes cloud, cloud becomes snow, snow becomes river. The same motion that shapes the ocean shapes the mountain. A shadow passed overhead, not fast, but deliberate. He lifted his gaze just in time to see the outline of an aerodactyl gliding between two peaks, its wings cutting through the thin air. With effortless grace, it vanished quickly into the mist, leaving behind only a faint tremor in the wind. He had seen such creatures before in the fossil records he kept, but their presence here always struck him with quiet awe. To see something ancient moving through something older still, it reminded him how small humanity truly was. The wind picked up, carrying with it the low hum of air moving through stone crevices. It was almost a voice, though without language. He knew better than to call it sound. It was the earth exhaling. He continued to write. The mountain breathes through the wind. Its voice is not meant to be understood, only felt. In that voice lies the truth of endurance. The day passed slowly. Shadows crept down the slopes, and the sun traced its long arc across the sky. He stayed still, letting time pass through him as freely as the wind. The silence here was different from that of the forest or sea. It was heavier, older, silence, not as absence, but as foundation. He remembered the first time he had climbed these ranges as a young man, searching for signs of rare Pokémon that nested among the cliffs. He had been impatient then, moving quickly, driven by discovery. But the mountains had offered him nothing until he stopped moving. Only when he sat, breath steady and mind empty, did the world reveal itself. A small geodude half buried in rock, a Machop's faint footprints along a ledge, the distant call of an unseen Pidgeot circling the summit. He smiled faintly at the memory. The mountains taught differently from the forest. The forest whispered through connection. The mountains through solitude. He turned to a new page. The silence of the mountain is not loneliness. It is clarity. It strips away everything that does not belong, leaving only what endures. The sun lowered behind a ridge, casting long shadows that stretched into the valley. The rocks glowed with muted gold, and for a brief moment, the entire range seemed alive with light. He watched as the colors shifted, from gold to orange, from orange to violet, then finally to blue. Night descended, not as darkness, but as calm. He could feel the temperature drop, the air sharpening. Somewhere far above, a gentle rumble echoed through the peaks, a shifting of stone perhaps, or the distant call of a nocturnal Pokémon stirring from its rest. The mountains never truly slept, they simply waited. He wrote one last passage as the stars began to appear. The stars are not far from the mountain. They are its reflection in the sky. Between them flows the same silence, the same endurance, the same patience. He closed his notebook and placed it beside him. The night had taken full hold now. The moon rose slowly, pale and perfect, casting silver light across the ridges. Every stone seemed to hum faintly with its glow. He sat motionless, breathing in rhythm with the world around him. Each breath was thin but steady, each heartbeat quiet and deep. The silence was no longer something external. It lived within him now, vast and unbroken. And as the mountain stood in its timeless stillness, the professor felt himself become part of it, not apart from the world, but within its quiet, eternal breath. The dawn returned with quiet inevitability. The professor woke to the faint shimmer of sunlight cresting over the distant peaks, its warmth spreading slowly through the cold mountain air. The first light did not announce itself. It arrived in silence, brushing the stone with soft gold, revealing contours and shadows that had slept through the night. He sat by the edge of his camp, watching the light move. It did not fall upon the world. It unfolded it. Every beam that touched the earth carried a memory of stars long extinguished, of fires born from creation itself. Light was time in motion, a message sent from the past. He lifted his journal and opened to a fresh page, the paper cool to the touch. His pen met it slowly, deliberately, each stroke measured with the same rhythm as the turning of the sun. Light does not reveal, he wrote. It remembers. Every sunrise carries within it the memory of the first. The light reached the lower ridges, tracing their lines with soft, steady grace. Snow began to gleam faintly in the distance, and thin streams of water, the mountain's slow tears, shimmered as they wound their way downward. The valley below stirred. The world reawakened. He thought of how many mornings he had seen like this. Each one seemed identical, yet none were the same. Every dawn carried a new story, a new angle, a different texture of air. Yet within them all lingered the same silent pulse, the reminder that light, like life, was fleeting and eternal all at once. He remembered the laboratory windows back in Pallet Town, how morning light would drift across the desks, sliding gently over books, fossils, and half-filled mugs of coffee. He could almost see the way it rested on the Pokeballs lined neatly in rows, softening their sheen. The sunlight had always been his first companion, silent, dependable, forgiving. He wrote again, slower this time. Light does not seek. It simply arrives. It does not choose where to fall. Yet, wherever it touches, something awakens. He lifted his gaze toward the horizon. The sky now burned with deeper golds and faint rose hues, a slow transformation that felt both tender and infinite. The mountains no longer stood in shadow. They gleamed with quiet pride, each ridge defined by brilliance. The professor exhaled softly. The warmth of light on his hands reminded him that even the most ancient places were never untouched by change. The sun had crossed this same sky for eons, yet each day it met a world slightly different. A leaf newly grown, a rock newly broken, a being newly born. The world changed because light demanded it to. Light teaches movement, he wrote. It refuses stillness. Even the mountain must surrender to its touch, grain by grain, century by century. He closed his eyes and felt the sunlight trace the lines of his face. The warmth seemed to sink into him, not merely as heat, but as memory. He could almost sense every moment that light had ever touched him. The first morning he stepped outside as a boy, the glow through the canopy of Viridian forest, the bright reflection off the sea where Lapras once sang. Each instant returned in quiet waves, linked by illumination. Light was the world remembering itself. He looked down at the open page before him, the ink gleaming faintly under the growing brilliance. For a moment, he saw his reflection there, not his face, but the faint shimmer of sunlight dancing on the surface of the words. The page had become both mirror and message. When we write, we give light a place to rest, he continued. Ink is sunlight translated into permanence. The wind rose briefly, carrying with it the scent of distant pines. Dust caught in the air, glittering as it passed through the beam beside him. The professor watched it drift. Every mote, a fragment of something once whole. Stone, leaf, breath, suspended for a moment in the golden air before vanishing again. He thought of how much the light revealed and how much it concealed. In brightness, shadows deepened. In illumination, mystery persisted. Every truth cast its own outline of doubt. Light was both clarity and deception, a paradox the natural world seemed to understand better than any mind could. The sun reveals shape, but not essence, he wrote. To see truly is to look beyond brightness. He remembered, faintly, the way certain Pokémon seemed to carry light within them, the soft bioluminescence of Chinchou beneath the sea, the steady flicker of Volbeat on humid nights, the shimmering aura of a Ninetales when it turned its gaze toward the horizon. Light was not only given, it was born. It lived inside everything that longed to be seen. The thought made him pause, pen hovering above the paper. Perhaps memory itself was a kind of light, fragile, glowing, and constantly shifting in color. He could feel his own memories stretching out like rays, reaching through time, some fading, others burning, brighter than they ever had. He resumed his writing, more slowly now, as if translating the sunlight itself into language. Memory is the light of the mind. What we recall, is what we choose to illuminate. The sun was higher now, the full weight of day, beginning to press against the slopes. The mountain air softened, the cold withdrew, and life returned. A faint shimmer of wings caught his eye, a pharaoh gliding far below, its feathers blazing gold against the valley mist. He followed its flight until it disappeared into the brightness. He breathed deeply, feeling the warmth on his skin, the wind across his face. He thought again of the countless mornings he had documented, each sunrise witnessed, each observation noted. And yet, none of those records had ever captured what this moment did. Light could be measured, but never owned. "Light is a visitor," he wrote. "The ink barely dry. It enters, it transforms, and it leaves. To cling to it is to forget its nature." The sun now climbed toward its zenith, the brilliance almost blinding. He closed the notebook gently, protecting its pages from the glare. The warmth around him was total, almost like being submerged in something endless. He sat there for a long while, eyes half open, not thinking, not writing, simply existing within the glow. The silence of the mountains merged with the hum of light itself. There was no distinction between what he saw and what he was. The observer and the world were one. When at last he rose, his movements were unhurried. He gathered his journal, his pen, and his satchel, then began the slow descent along the sunlit path. Every stone beneath his feet caught the light. Every shadow followed him like a memory. The mountain, too, seemed to breathe in rhythm with the sun, expanding, warming, remembering. And as he walked, he felt that the light itself was watching him, not as a witness, but as an old companion, quietly recording his passage in the endless memory of the day. The path wound downward, and with each step, the sound of running water grew clearer. It began as a faint whisper through the rocks, a distant murmur beneath the breath of wind, until it deepened into something that filled the air entirely. The professor followed it patiently, the rhythm of his footsteps matching the rhythm of the unseen current. When the trees thinned and the slope leveled, he saw it at last. The river lay stretched across the valley like a ribbon of light, its surface gleaming under the late morning sun. It moved with the calm persistence of something ancient, something that had never forgotten its origin. He stood at the bank and watched. The water flowed neither fast nor slow, only steady, every droplet distinct, yet inseparable from the whole. He could see his reflection bending and reforming with each ripple, never constant, never still. He sat upon a smooth stone and opened his notebook. The pages fluttered briefly in the gentle breeze before settling. The sound of the river filled the silence around him, a continuous, low melody that seemed to breathe. "The river carries everything," he wrote. "Soil, leaf, light, and memory. Nothing remains where it began, yet nothing is ever truly lost." He looked up. The water was clear enough to see the stones beneath its surface, each one polished by time, shaped by endless motion. Small Magikarp darted between them, their scales catching fragments of light. A Goldeen glided in the deeper channel, its fins trailing like ribbons of silk. Even here, in this quiet valley, life followed the river's endless journey. The professor thought of how many rivers he had seen, from mountain streams to the vast currents that fed the sea. Each one seemed to tell the same story, not in words, but in rhythm. The river's voice was time itself, spoken through water. He dipped his fingers into the current. It was cold, but alive, sliding smoothly across his skin. The sensation was immediate and fleeting, as if the river acknowledged him before continuing on its way. He felt no need to interrupt it. "The water never resists," he wrote. "It yields, and in yielding, it endures. The mountain stands still and wears away. The river moves and remains. The sunlight shifted, The glimmer upon the water broke into 1,000 small reflections, each one flickering like a heartbeat. He watched the dance of light upon the ripples and thought of how similar it was to memory, bright, fragile, constantly shifting shape. He remembered the streams that ran through Pallet Town, how children once played along the shallows, chasing pollywog and laughing at the cool splash of water. He had seen generations grow beside those banks, each leaving behind echoes of their joy. The river there had carried them all, not their bodies, but their moments. Perhaps, he wrote, the river is the world's memory. It holds what the land forgets, and it brings it home again. He followed the flow with his eyes, tracing it as it curved gently between the trees, vanishing behind a bend. The thought filled him with quiet comfort. Every stream found its way to the ocean, and every ocean returned to the clouds. Nothing in the world ever truly ended. It only changed form. The sound deepened as a breeze swept through the valley. Leaves shivered. The river darkened momentarily under the shadow of passing clouds, then brightened again as the light returned. It was as if the world were breathing with the current. He turned to a new page. To listen to a river is to listen to movement made eternal. It speaks not of destinations, but of continuity. He closed his eyes for a moment. The sound surrounded him, soft, layered, without beginning or end. It was not music, yet it held harmony. He thought of how the same water that touched his hand now might someday fall as rain upon distant soil or rise again as mist above a foreign shore. The river did not belong to any place. It was the traveler that united them all. The professor leaned back, hands resting upon the stone behind him. The sun was warm, but the breeze carried the chill of water. A gentle peace settled within him. Deeper than thought, he realized that he had stopped measuring time since he'd begun this journey. The flow of the river had become his clock. He wrote again, his hand moving with unhurried precision. If the forest teaches patience and the mountain endurance, then the river teaches surrender. It shows that to move is not to lose oneself. Far downstream, he saw a flock of wingulls skimming the surface, their wings dipping briefly into the water. Each touch left a circle that spread outward, merging with others until the entire surface seemed to pulse. Even the birds had become part of the rhythm. He smiled faintly. The world was full of such patterns, visible only to those who slowed down enough to see them. Everything connected. The rain that fell, the roots that drank it, the breath that exhaled it. Even the river's endless song was only one verse in a greater harmony. He thought of the many years he had spent classifying Pokémon by type, by region, by trait. He had seen order as the path to knowledge. But here, beside the river, order dissolved into flow. The distinctions blurred, as they were meant to. There is no true separation in nature, he wrote. Only motion between states. The river reminds us that all forms are temporary, all borders imagined. The day grew long. The river shimmered differently now, the sunlight gentler, lower, tinged with amber. Shadows lengthened across the stones. The sound of the current grew deeper, slower, as if preparing to rest. He watched as a few leaves detached from a branch above and landed upon the surface. They spun slowly, drifting together before parting. He followed them with his eyes until they were carried beyond sight. So too do lives pass, he wrote softly. Each one caught, briefly in the current, each one carried onward. To the river, there is no loss, only motion. The wind softened again, and for a while there was only the sound of water and the faint rustle of trees. He closed his notebook and set it aside, feeling the pulse of the world through the soles of his feet. It was the same pulse that had always been, in the ocean tides, in the beating of wings, in the steady rhythm of his own heart. He understood now what he had been seeking all along. Not knowledge in the sense of facts, but in the sense of presence. The kind of knowing that required no answer. the kind that came from simply existing within the flow of things. He took a final look at the water before rising. The current caught the last light of the sun, turning gold, then crimson, then fading into shadow. The song of the river continued, unbroken, and as he walked along its edge, following the path downstream, it seemed to follow him in return. A quiet, endless voice that spoke of time, of change, and of the peace that comes from moving without resistance. The morning carried a stillness too perfect to last. The professor felt it before he saw it. That heavy, quiet air that waits at the edge of change. The forest below the mountains lay unmoving, its canopy subdued beneath a sky that had begun to dim in tone. The light was not gone, but it had changed its weight. It pressed differently against the land, as though the sun itself held its breath. He had walked since dawn, following the curve of the river into lower terrain. The air had grown warmer, thicker, alive with an unseen tension. Insects moved restlessly. The cries of bird Pokémon grew sparse. Even the river's rhythm seemed altered, a deeper, more deliberate pulse, as if anticipating something. He reached a clearing where the water widened into a shallow basin. Stones broke the surface like islands, slick with moss. The reflections upon them had begun to fade, replaced by the strange dullness of light that precedes rain. He sat upon one of the stones and listened. The dullness, silence, was immense, not in absence, but in density. The world held its breath. The storm is the world remembering its power, he wrote. It returns to remind stillness that peace is not the same as life. The first sound came like a whisper across the horizon, not thunder yet, but a murmur of wind through unseen heights. The leaves trembled. The surface of the water rippled. And then, from far beyond the trees, a single low rumble began to build. He watched the clouds gather. They did not rush. They assembled, as if drawn by memory, layer upon layer of gray folded into the sky, until the light dimmed to the color of stone. The river darkened with it, its surface reflecting the slow birth of storm. The professor remained still. The pen in his hand trembled faintly, not from fear, but from anticipation. There is no malice in the storm, he wrote. It is balance in motion, the sky correcting itself. A cool wind passed across his face, carrying the scent of electricity and wet soil. It was followed by another, stronger, then another still. The air thickened, heavy with potential. The forest swayed like a single breathing creature. The first drop fell, a sound small and perfect, striking the open page of his notebook. It left a mark, absorbed into the fibers, like a signature. Then came another, and another, until the world around him filled with the steady rhythm of rain. He closed the notebook gently and held it against his chest, protecting it as best he could. The rain grew heavier, cascading in sheets, blurring the horizon into motion. He could feel each droplet striking his skin, cold and immediate, 1,000 small impacts merging into one vast sensation. The wind rose. Trees bent and swayed, their leaves flashing silver as they turned beneath the rain. The sound deepened, a mixture of rustle and roar, water and wind, movement and voice. The storm had fully arrived. He did not seek shelter. He simply stood, letting the world move around him. There was an energy here, unlike any other. Chaotic, yes, but pure. The same power that destroyed also restored. It tore down the dead branches, cleared the air of dust, carried away the stagnant. He closed his eyes, and for a long time, he simply listened. The sound was total, so immense it ceased to be noise and became a kind of rhythm. Every pulse of thunder felt like the heartbeat of the world itself. Destruction is not the end, he thought. It is the renewal of space for what has yet to grow. Lightning flashed somewhere beyond the forest. The brief burst illuminated the shapes of the land, the river gleaming silver, the trunks of trees bright and skeletal for an instant, then vanishing back into darkness. The thunder followed, rolling deep and long, echoing through the valley, like memory returning to its source. He felt small before it, but not insignificant. The storm did not diminish life. It placed it in perspective. Every leaf, every stone, every breath was part of the same pulse, the same vast exchange of energy that had shaped the world since its beginning. The rain began to pool around his boots, streams forming tiny rivulets that fed back into the main current. Even now, the river accepted everything without resistance, swelling gently, carrying it onward. He found himself thinking of the Pokémon that lived in such conditions, how some thrived where others sought shelter. He imagined a group of Lotad drifting calmly among the reeds, their lily-like backs catching rainwater. An Electabuzz standing tall on a distant hill, drawing energy from the storm's electric air. For them, chaos was not disruption, but home. Each being meets the storm as it must, he wrote, when the rain softened. Some endure, some dance, and some drink the thunder as if it were light. Gradually, the fury began to fade. The thunder grew distant. The lightning thinned to brief flickers. The wind calmed into sighs. The rain, once relentless, slowed to a steady drizzle, then to drops that fell one by one from the leaves above. The professor sat once more upon the stone. The river was higher now, its voice deeper, carrying branches and petals and fragments of earth. The scent of wet soil filled the air, sharp, clean, full of renewal. The storm leaves nothing untouched, he wrote again, but in its wake, everything is new. He looked around him. The forest glistened, each leaf coated with tiny jewels of water. The sky had begun to open again, revealing faint streaks of gold through the clouds. The air was clearer, the light gentler. Even the earth beneath his hands felt different, as though it had exhaled something long held. He dipped his fingers into the river once more. It was colder now, stronger, more alive. The current carried pieces of the storm downstream, a story written in motion. Peace that follows chaos, he thought, is not the same as before. It is deeper, truer, earned. The last drops fell from the canopy like a closing cadence. The forest settled into stillness again, but not silence. Every surface whispered faintly as it dried. The storm's song had ended, but its echo lingered in the air. A low hum of completion. He watched the light return, golden and warm, against the soaked leaves. The sun touched the river again, transforming it into a long, glistening path. The sky above cleared in slow, patient layers, until the blue returned, calm, endless, forgiving. He stood, brushing the moisture from his coat, and breathed deeply. The scent of the storm remained, electric, metallic, alive. It reminded him that nothing in the world existed without contrast. Without darkness, light was meaningless. Without stillness, movement had no rhythm. He opened his notebook once more, turning to the final damp pages and writing with deliberate care. The storm does not destroy peace. It restores it. The world must break to remember how to breathe. Close the book gently, the sound of the river steady beside him. The clouds moved on, slow and bright-edged, leaving behind a sky that seemed wider than before. The professor looked once more toward the horizon, where light met water, where silence followed thunder, and smiled faintly. The storm had passed, but its song remained, flowing within him like a river that would never cease. The land began to level as the mountains receded behind him. The professor could tell by the quality of light that the day had begun its slow surrender into evening. The sun was low now, not falling, but folding, sinking into the horizon with the tenderness of rest. The field stretched endlessly before him. Grass swayed in slow, circular motion, each blade catching the sunlight like a quiet flame. The scent of pollen and soil mixed with the faint salt of the distant sea. Every breath carried warmth, and every movement felt suspended, as though time itself were hesitating before night. He walked without purpose, other than presence. The rhythm of his steps matched the rhythm of the wind. It was a pace learned over many years of study, the pace of someone who understood that to rush was to miss the quiet conversations of the world. The field was alive in a way that required stillness to perceive. From beneath the tall grass came the gentle hum of life, the soft chirp of cricketot hidden among roots, the delicate rustle of ratata tracing invisible paths, the occasional flicker of light as a small group of cutiefly drifted past, shimmering in the amber air. Above, a single pidgeot soared in slow circles. Its wings caught the dying sunlight, turning it into gold. It was not hunting, nor searching, merely gliding, carried by the calm. The professor followed its motion with his eyes, his thoughts moving as lightly as the wind that brushed the field. Evening, he wrote in his notebook, is the memory of day remembering how to sleep. He walked until the land opened wider, where the grass gave way to wildflowers. Petals of violet, white, and pale blue swayed as one body. Each movement was soft, unhurried. It was as though the earth itself were breathing through color. He stopped and let his hand drift through the comb. Blossoms. They bent easily, offering no resistance. The sensation of them, cool, delicate, alive, brought a quiet smile to his face. These were the same fields he had crossed as a young researcher, chasing fleeting shapes, recording the smallest signs of Pokémon unseen by most eyes. Decades had passed, and yet nothing here had truly changed. The field endured. Some places, he thought, do not keep time. They keep presence. He sat among the flowers, setting his notebook on his knee. The light had grown richer now, deeper gold giving way to gentle rose, the sky softening into gradients that seemed painted by breath. Somewhere far off, a flock of swablu moved together, their small cloud-like bodies glowing faintly against the sunset. The professor watched them drift until they vanished into the horizon. He felt no sadness at their leaving, only the sense that all things return in their own time. He turned another page and wrote, "The world does not end in endings. It folds back into itself, beginning again with quieter intention." He listened. The sounds of the field had shifted. Day creatures were retreating, their voices softening, while others began to wake. From the far edges came the low, rising hum of nocturnal wings, the gentle oscillation of a venomoth, perhaps, beginning its nightly dance. The balance of the world changed almost imperceptibly, yet completely. The transition from light to dark was neither sudden nor slow. It was seamless, a breath taken in by one half of the earth and exhaled by the other. He closed his eyes and let that rhythm pass through him. The scent of the flowers, the hum of insects, the cooling air, all of it formed a quiet harmony. The field was a place without judgment. It asked for nothing, gave everything, and in return, it accepted each passing moment as it came. He felt the faint vibration of footsteps through the ground, the quiet movement of something unseen. Perhaps a Nidoran, returning to its burrow, or a centret making its small path home. The earth was always full of motion, though rarely did it announce itself. He looked toward the west. The sun had touched the horizon now, flattening into a wide, soft glow that spread across the land. Shadows lengthened, merging gently with one another until they formed one continuous pool of calm. He wrote again, "Light does not vanish. It becomes memory stored within the quiet of the ground." The sky deepened to violet. Stars began to appear, faint at first, then stronger, each one steady and familiar. The field reflected that shift, as if mirroring the heavens. The petals beneath him caught what remained of the light, turning each flower into a small, dim lantern. The professor rested his notebook beside him and reclined against the earth. The grass bent beneath his weight, cradling him as if recognizing his return. The air had cooled further now, but not coldly. It was the kind of chill that invited stillness rather than discomfort. Above, a few small shapes passed, nocturnal Pokémon beginning their wanderings. A single hoot-hoot perched on a distant branch, its round silhouette perfectly still against the dimming sky. Somewhere nearer, a group of illumise began to flicker, their soft blue lights weaving patterns through the darkening air. The sight stirred something gentle in him, the understanding that life did not stop with the end of the day. It only changed its rhythm. For every creature that slept, another awakened. The cycle remained unbroken. He reached for his notebook once more, his handwriting now slower, deliberate, shaped by the quiet of nightfall. To live is to turn with the rhythm of the world. To rest is to listen to it, breathe. The stars multiplied above him, and for a long while, he wrote nothing more. Words no longer felt necessary. The silence spoke well enough. He thought of the days behind him, of the sea's whisper, the forest's memory, the mountains' stillness, the storm's renewal. Each moment, each place, had taught in its own language. Yet here, in the open field, all those lessons merged into one single truth. That peace was not an escape from the world, but a way of belonging within it. He drew a slow breath and let it go. The wind answered in kind, passing softly across the field like a familiar hand. He wrote his final words of the day. The world does not ask us to understand it, only to witness. He closed the notebook and lay back, his gaze lost among the stars. The field swayed in silence around him, an ocean of grass moving to the rhythm of a wind older than memory. The night deepened, not as darkness, but as embrace. And there, between the fading warmth of the sun and the slow pulse of the earth beneath him, the professor felt a truth that needed no words at all, that the journey was not a search for meaning, but a return to stillness. The sky glowed faintly with starlight. The field breathed. The world slept. And the professor, at last, rested with it. The door to the study opened with the soft creak of age. Dust motes drifted in the shaft of evening light that crossed the room, glimmering like suspended fragments of memory. The professor stepped inside slowly, each footfall stirring the scent of paper, ink, and wood that had long since absorbed the quiet rhythm of years. The library had not changed. Shelves rose like small cliffs on every side, lined with volumes bound in fading leather, journals stacked upon journals, pages filled with the handwriting of decades. The air was cool, still, touched by the faint hum of the outside world. The distant calls of night Pokémon, the slow turning of the sea breeze through an open window. He stood for a moment in the center of the room, his gaze traveling across the familiar order of things. Every object here had a place, and yet each seemed part of a larger pattern, one that spoke not of control, but of patience. The desk near the window was covered in papers, neatly arranged though, untouched for months. His pen rested there as it always had, beside an inkwell still half full. The glass reflected the dim light, creating a quiet pulse upon the surface, like a heartbeat slowed almost to stillness. He moved closer, fingers tracing the edges of the books. Each title stirred something within him. Studies of early Pokémon behavior, the rhythms of natural evolution, the hidden song of the sea. These were not just records of discovery. They were fragments of self, moments captured before they could fade. He opened one, an old field journal, its pages yellowed and soft. The writing was smaller than he remembered, more urgent. Notes about migration patterns, sketches of habitats, the smallest details of wings, scales, and soil composition. He smiled faintly. How much of the man who wrote these pages remained? How much had changed in the slow drift of time? He sat at the desk and let the journal rest open before him. The ink upon its pages had faded, but it had not vanished. Every word remained legible, preserved by care and stillness. The world outside might shift endlessly, but thought, once given form, could linger beyond its moment. He reached for his pen, dipped it once in the ink, and let the tip hover over a blank page. But no words came. For once, he felt that silence said enough. There comes a time, he thought, when writing must yield to remembering. The light through the window dimmed, deepening from gold to gray. Shadows grew longer, merging at the corners of the room. Yet there was nothing ominous in their shape, only calm. The library breathed with him, expanding and contracting with every motion of air. He looked at the shelves again, realizing how each book had been a conversation, not only with the world he studied, but with himself. Every observation, every hypothesis, every quiet correction was a dialogue between curiosity and reverence. He rose and walked to the far wall, where the oldest texts rested. Those, written by others long before him, names half forgotten, languages nearly lost. He ran his hand along the spines, feeling the impressions of letters carved by hands that no longer existed. Knowledge, he thought, was never a possession. It was a flame passed forward, flickering from one heart to another. Each word is a bridge, he murmured inwardly. Each silence, a crossing. A faint breeze entered through the open window, carrying with it the sound of the distant field. Crickets began their soft chorus. The night outside was alive again, though within these walls, time seemed suspended. The professor closed his eyes for a moment and listened. He could hear the subtle creak of shelves adjusting, the whisper of paper settling, the low hum of life in the distance. Every sound formed part of the same vast rhythm, the quiet continuity that linked all things. He returned to the desk, opened another book, and found within it a letter, folded, delicate, sealed, with the faint trace of wax. The handwriting upon the front was his own, though from years long past. He broke the seal carefully. The letter contained few words, only a reminder written to himself. When you forget what you sought, return to why you began. He read it twice, perhaps 3 times, before setting it down. The message was simple, but its truth infinite. Discovery had never been about answers. It had always been about relationship, the act of seeing, of listening, of belonging. He let the paper fall closed again and placed it back within the book. Then, with deliberate motion, he began to gather a few journals from the desk. Not many, only enough to fill a small satchel. He had carried these across continents once, and now they would accompany him home. The shadows deepened further. The line of light upon the floor faded until only the reflection of the moon remained. The window framed the night sky, pale stars shimmering against the quiet black. He looked around the library once more, knowing it would outlast him, that others might one day walk these same floors, touch these same pages, hear the same stillness. He hoped they would feel what he felt now. Not pride, not achievement, but gratitude. The knowledge we leave behind, he thought, is not a monument. It is a path back to wonder. He sat again, just long enough to write a single final note in the blank book before him. His pen moved slowly, its rhythm calm, unforced. I have seen the sea breathe, the forest remember, the mountain endure, and the storm renew. I have walked among the living silence of the world, and I have learned that to know is to listen. The room, wrapped in shadow, seemed to hold its breath around him, not to end, but to rest. The professor rose, slung the satchel over his shoulder, and turned toward the open door. The moonlight followed him down the corridor, illuminating dust like drifting stars. He did not look back. The library did not ask him to. It would remain, a vessel of silence and light, a place where words slept beside their meanings. As he stepped out into the night, the cool air embraced him once more. The field stretched beyond, shimmering faintly in moonlight. The world was vast again, patient, eternal, alive. And behind him, in the quiet house of knowledge, the shadows settled gently among the books, as if keeping watch over all that had ever been learned and all that still waited to be. The path began beneath a veil of moonlight, winding through the grass that whispered with each step. The professor moved slowly, his pace measured by the quiet rhythm of the earth. The air was cool but not cold, and it carried the scent of open fields and distant sea salt. Somewhere far behind him, the mountains slept in shadow, their peaks invisible against the dark sky. Ahead, the horizon shimmered faintly, the direction of home. He walked, with no need for haste. The world no longer required his discovery. It asked only for his presence. The moon hung low, its reflection caught in the gentle curve of the path, like a silver coin pressed into the soil. Every footfall left a soft impression, soon erased by the breathing of the wind. He carried little. The satchel upon his shoulder was light, a few journals, a pen, and a single folded letter. The weight was not in the objects, but in the quiet history they contained. Each page within carried not conclusions, but moments, the brief intersections of his life, with the endless rhythm of the world. The night around him was alive, with muted sound. Hoot hoot, called softly from a nearby branch. In the grass, joltik flickered like fragments of electricity caught in motion. A gentle rustle revealed the slow crawl of a shuckle beneath a fallen leaf, moving at a pace the professor understood intimately. The stillness of the path was not emptiness, but conversation, a dialogue between motion and rest. He paused at the crest of a small hill. From there, the land unfolded beneath him in a long, quiet expanse. The ocean stretched far beyond, its dark surface glimmering faintly in the moonlight. Between him and that distant line lay the fields of his youth, the gentle hills near Pallet, the same trees he had once measured, the same air he had once breathed in wonder. All journeys, he thought, are circles drawn slowly enough to seem like lines. He descended the hill. The path became narrower, framed by wildflowers now closed for the night. Their petals folded inward, as though sleeping. The scent that rose from them was faint but pure, carrying the cool sweetness of the earth. He breathed it in deeply, and for a moment, it felt as though he were inhaling the memory of every season that had ever passed. He thought of the people he had met along the way, students, researchers, travelers, each drawn by curiosity, each carrying their own small light of understanding. He had once believed that knowledge was built from answers, but now he knew it was shaped by presence. The world revealed itself not to those who demanded, but to those who waited. The night deepened as he approached the lower plains. The stars shone brighter here, mirrored faintly in the dew that had begun to gather on the grass. Each drop of water caught the light, becoming a tiny reflection of the sky. The professor paused, kneeling briefly to observe the world inverted in the smallest sphere the universe held. Within a single point, infinity, he wrote in his mind, exists in the smallest motion, if only one looks long enough. He rose again and continued. The air grew softer, carrying the warmth of the sea. The familiar outline of Pallet Town began to form in the distance, faint, barely visible, yet unmistakable. A few lights glowed within its quiet streets. Beyond them, the edge of the forest, where he had once gathered samples as a young man, still stood, unchanged, the same gentle outline against the sky. The moon drifted higher. Its light silvered the rooftops of the town as he neared. The sound of the sea grew stronger, waves turning against the sand in slow rhythm, each crest a breath, each retreat a whisper. The professor stopped once more at the old wooden gate that marked the beginning of his property. The wood was rough beneath his hand, weathered by rain and years, yet still strong. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The small path that led to his home was cut overgrown with wild grass. He did not mind. The earth was reclaiming what it had lent him, and that seemed right. The door of the house stood slightly ajar. He entered quietly, though there was no one to disturb. The air inside carried the faint scent of dried herbs and parchment, the remnants of days long gone. He set his satchel on the table and removed the journals one by one. He placed them neatly in a small wooden box, closing the lid gently. There was no ceremony, only stillness, the final gesture of a long journey coming to rest. He opened the window beside the table. The sea's rhythm filled the room, calm and steady. The moonlight spilled across the floor, touching the corners of his notes, the shelves, the small globe he had once used to trace his expeditions. Everything glowed softly, alive in reflection. He stood for a long moment, simply breathing. The house felt smaller than he remembered, but also warmer. It no longer felt like a place of work, but of return. He moved to the chair by the window, the one he had always favored, and sat. Outside, the waves continued their slow, eternal cadence. The stars shone clearly, their light unbroken. The path home, he thought, is not an ending. It is the quiet between questions. He leaned back, feeling the weight of the years settle around him, gentle and full. The air had grown cool again, carrying with it the faint hum of the night. Somewhere in the distance, a lapras sang, its voice low and resonant, echoing across the water. The sound drifted through the window, filling the house with calm. It was a song he had heard many times before, yet tonight it felt different, closer, more intimate, as though it carried with it the sum of everything he had ever known. He closed his eyes, listening. Each note of the lapras's call rose and fell like the tide, and within it he could hear the memory of every journey, every place, every silence. The sea, the forest, the storm, the stars, all converged here, within this moment. He did not write this time. The world, he realized, had already written enough. The lapras's song faded slowly, merging with the whisper of the waves. The professor exhaled deeply, the breath leaving him like a final punctuation to a story without end. Outside, the moon continued its patient course, unbothered by the passage of time. Inside, the house rested in perfect stillness. And in that stillness, between the sea's eternal rhythm and the faint rustle of the wind through the grass, the path home disappeared into peace. Dawn arrived without announcement. It did not break. It unfolded. A slow brightening of air, a thinning of shadow. The first light came quietly through the open window, tracing pale lines across the wooden floor. The house, still and silent, began to breathe again. The professor stirred. He had not truly slept, but neither had he remained awake. He existed in that gentle state between, where thought dissolves into dream, and dream becomes reflection. The rhythm of the sea had carried him through the night, its steady voice weaving through the stillness like a heartbeat beneath the surface of silence. He rose slowly, feeling the soft pull of morning in his bones. The world outside had changed color. What had been silver now glowed with faint gold. The grass beyond the window shimmered with dew. Each drop held a tiny sun within it, trembling and bright. He stepped outside. The door opened to a wash of cool air, and the scent of salt and earth mingled with light. The sea stretched endlessly before him, calm now, its surface smooth as glass, each ripple catching the sun's first rays. Above, windgull drifted in slow arcs, their wings carving white paths across the rose-colored sky. The world was quiet, but not empty. It was the quiet of fullness, of everything existing in balance, neither waiting nor wanting. He stood barefoot in the grass, the soil damp beneath his feet. The chill met the warmth of his skin, a reminder that even in simplicity, Life carried infinite texture. He could hear the faint buzzing of combi among the wildflowers near the path, the soft rustle of leaves stirred by gentle wind. Every sound blended into harmony, as though the morning itself were composing a song too slow for time to measure. He breathed deeply, letting the air fill him completely. Each breath seemed to carry both memory and renewal. Morning, he thought, is the earth remembering itself. He turned his gaze toward the horizon. The sun was rising fully now, its light reaching across the sea in a long golden bridge. The sight stirred something wordless within him, a recognition not of destination, but of return. He walked to the edge of the property, where the grass met the sand. The tide was low, the waves small and even. The shore glowed with color. Coral pinks, soft ambers, pale blues reflected from the sky. Small shelter shells dotted the sand like scattered thoughts. Each one caught a fragment of light. He watched the water move. It approached, retreated, approached again, never ceasing, never hurrying. He had studied this pattern for decades, yet it still humbled him. Each wave was unique, yet each belonged to the same rhythm. The sea was not repetition, it was persistence given form. To understand the world, he thought, is to understand that it is never still, yet always whole. He sat upon a smooth rock at the water's edge. The tide reached for his boots and drew back again. His reflection wavered in the shallow water, fractured by movement. For a moment he saw himself not as separate, but as part of the motion, the sea, the wind, the light, and the man observing them all merging into one quiet presence. The wind lifted slightly, carrying the scent of salt and grass. It rustled the pages of the notebook he carried, still half full, resting upon his lap. He opened it to a blank page. The paper caught the morning light, gleaming faintly. He held the pen above it, hesitating not out of doubt, but reverence. There was no need for another theory, no new observation to record. Only this moment, the meeting of light, sea, and stillness. He began to write, his handwriting slower than ever. Each stroke deliberate, as though carved rather than drawn. The world does not speak in answers. It speaks in continuance. Every breath, every wave, every leaf in wind says only this, that being is enough. He paused. The words looked simple upon the page, but he knew they carried the entirety of what he had sought all his life. Not knowledge, but understanding. Not explanation, but belonging. He closed the notebook gently. The light upon the sea grew brighter, filling the horizon with color so pure it seemed soundless. The professor rested his hands upon the closed journal and looked outward one last time. He could feel the pulse of the world, steady, endless, the same pulse that had moved through every discovery, every silence, every story he had ever recorded. The sun climbed higher, and with it came warmth, not fierce, but embracing. The dew upon the grass began to rise in small veils of mist, catching the sunlight as it lifted. The world shimmered, alive with quiet motion. He smiled faintly. The expression was not of joy or sadness, but of recognition, the acceptance of a circle completed. Light, he thought, is memory returning to itself. He rose once more and began to walk the length of the shore. His steps left faint impressions in the wet sand, each one soon softened by the tide. He did not look back. There was no need. The sea erased nothing. It simply carried it onward. The sound of the waves grew softer as he moved, merging with the gentle hum of morning. Above him, clouds drifted slowly, pale against the deepening blue. A school of mantike leapt briefly from the water, their shapes outlined by light before vanishing again beneath the surface. The motion was fleeting, yet perfect, a moment existing wholly within itself. He stopped once more, turning to face the horizon. The sun had risen fully now. The sky, the water, the land, all burned with soft radiance. For a long time he stood there, still and silent, watching the world breathe. Then, with emotion so slight it barely disturbed the air, he opened his notebook one final time and wrote 3 last words, not as conclusion, but as offering. "I am home." He closed it. The wind lifted gently, carrying the scent of salt and grass once more. The sea glimmered, unbroken. The professor exhaled, slow, steady, whole. The last light of morning rested upon him like memory made visible, and the world continued, vast and quiet and complete.